thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, the late show. Really excited tonight. We are going to be discussing bridging the cultural chasm in language learning with a panel of 4 experts. We're really looking forward to this one. I know it's going to be extremely interesting, and it'll be hosted by Darren, who we're going to be introducing in just a moment. The show is brought to you in association with Pearson MFL, and as I say, we're going to have 4 top expert panelists joining us very shortly to discuss this. Darren, how are you this evening?
I'm very well, Tom. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well. I wondered whether I'm going to ask you a question before anyone joins. Perhaps.
Oh,
I know it is, isn't it? Because I'm not an MFL teacher, so can you explain to me what we mean when we say the cultural chasm?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I can tell you what
Yes.
I mean by it, and then I'll be interested to see whether our panelists agree. So there's this concept that was put forward by Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron, which is called the cultural capital. And basically, it's this idea that our students are privileged in different ways when it comes to culture. So, you know, in MFL terms, it's the students who go to Spain on holiday every year and so have exposure to Spanish culture, to the Spanish language, versus those who don't do that and they go to Weston-super-Mare every single year, and so they don't have that same cultural and linguistic experience and motivation almost. And so when we talk about the cultural chasm, we talk about that gap between the students who have the opportunity and the privilege to go on holiday to foreign countries, to read books in different languages, even down to simple things that we might take for granted, such as going to museums, going to the ballet, watching anime. Even, you know, students with a Netflix account and so can watch popular anime really easily on TV versus those who don't have access to that kind of streaming service. And so what I'm hoping we're going to talk about today is how we can kind of put a bridge over that chasm and take the students who don't have the same access to these cultural ideas, to this cultural capital, and try and raise it for them a little bit.
Brilliant. No, that makes absolutely perfect sense. And you know, just to sort of introduce it all, do you think this is a bigger issue in Britain than it is in other countries? I know that's a random question, but is that one of the key issues, or is it the same?
No, I mean, yeah, that's a really good question, I think. Based on my experience, I do think that it is a huge issue for students in Britain versus students in other countries. And I think a lot of that is to do with how our culture, how our society is set up. So if you are anywhere in Europe, you have very easy access to English language stuff. You know, again, you can put any TV channel on and you can watch English language TV. I remember teaching in the Netherlands, and my students' parents would come and pick them up and they would greet them in English, and they would have a conversation in English first about how their day was before switching to Dutch. And so there is, you know, you go to supermarkets. This is probably an experience most of us have had. You go to Carrefour in France and you can hear English language music being played over the stereo.
Yeah.
And so because Anglophone culture, particularly American culture, is so pervasive, so prevalent, I do think that international students who learn English as a second language do have that kind of cultural benefit over British students who don't.
Superb. Right. I mean, that's a fantastic introduction to the show. It might be worth me saying now a massive thanks to Pearson for supporting the show, and obviously it's going to be a really interesting discussion. If you want to find out more about Pearson's new MFL GCSE qualifications, we've pinned a link to the tweet at the top of the space where you can just click it to find out more. If you're listening to this as a podcast or listening to it back on Spotify or Apple Podcast, we will issue the link on there so you can find out more on the show description. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to be quiet now, and I think we've got Adam and Fiona joining us. I'm going to pass over to Darren.
Well, thank you very much. I am so excited about this one. I'm very grateful to Pearson for giving us the opportunity to host this event today, and I'm very grateful, of course, to our panel of guests who are joining me, so that you are not just having to listen to me chat on for 2 hours about cultural capital. We do have Fiona and Adam in the chat. I can see that. Good
Hello.
evening to you both.
Hi,
Hello.
it's great to be here.
Oh, so happy to have you both here. I think what would be quite nice, the way that we did it in the last show, would be for the two of you to introduce yourselves, if that's okay, because then you can decide what you do and don't want our listeners to know about you. So Fiona, would you like to go first? Just let us know a little bit about who you are, what your role is at Pearson.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on the MFL product manager team. So rather than devising the qualification, we're actually coming up with the supporting resources that we'll be launching next year for the new GCSE 2024. But I'm quite new to publishing. I've been at Pearson for a year, and my background was very much teaching. So I did TEFL to start with, and then I was a secondary school teacher for many years, 23 years, with a little interlude where I did primary MFL. So I've kind of seen all sides, really. I think I've taught languages to everyone from about 3 to, well, 73 probably. So yeah, I'm really passionate about cultural capital. I think opening kids' horizons to having a global outlook is absolutely core. It's, completely central to what we do as language teachers. I've, led countless trips, done endless things to get kids really buzzing about the culture. And I've taught mainly Spanish in the last sort of 15 years, but I also am a German specialist, and I teach French as well to year 7 and 8. So I kind of, have those two hats on, publishing, but very much like a teacher background.
Oh, I love it, Joe. I'm very jealous of your career journey, Fiona. It sounds like we've got a very similar kind of teaching background, because I've done the same. I was initially a PMFL specialist before moving into secondary, and publishing is the arena that I would like to get into. So yeah, very jealous of all your experiences. That's really cool.
Yeah, well, I never expected this to happen, to be honest. But obviously, it's a really exciting time at Pearson with the new qualifications coming out. And we've got a big team now making all the resources to go with it, because obviously we're going to deliver some, fantastic courses, and rich culture is going to be very much at the heart of those courses that we're putting together for French, Spanish and German. So I'm the Spanish lead, but obviously working very closely with the other languages. And we didn't actually have sight of the spec until November when it came out. So we haven't had,
wow.
massive amounts of preparation. I think people sort of think, oh, you must have known about this for years. But obviously we couldn't really find out what quals we're doing really until it was all made public. So we're kind of quickly getting up to speed now so we can get everything ready for teachers to support them and their students.
Oh, absolutely. And do you know what? That is strangely reassuring, to be honest, that you get the information at about the same time that we do. It's nice to feel like we're all in this together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the thing. I think language teachers are just an incredible bunch of people who are just, all teachers are passionate about their subjects. Of course they are. But I think language teachers, because you do so many trips, and it's there's just so much involved in it. And it is, at the moment, it's getting all that press of being a kind of subject in decline. And I just think language teachers are having none of that. We're not having that. The UK isn't good at languages. No way, not on our watch. And, we just need to really support and make sure that everybody's getting the best experience they can, teachers and students, and the SLT are on board with supporting everyone to make sure that we have linguists to teach the next generations, because it's absolutely critical.
Absolutely. Fiona, thank you. That was really really interesting to learn about your background. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Of course, Adam needs no introduction to the members of the MFL community. But having said that, Adam, if you wouldn't mind, just for anybody who hasn't encountered you recently, would you like to just tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, can you hear me first of all? I've got my AirPods
Yes.
in.
Yeah, you're good.
So yeah, I'm Adam Lamb. I'm a head of faculty in East London, not the northeast of England, deceptively. I'm a head of faculty. I've got a degree in Spanish, Russian, and Czech, of all things. And one of the things I'm really interested in is, obviously, you can probably hear through my accent, I'm very much a Durham Coalfield boy.
Yeah.
Taught. Still often go up there to see my wonderful border collie that my mum and dad own. And I think
I
social
like the order of
mobility,
that. Border Collie first.
border collie first, definitely. But social mobility and culture, I guess, I think are two things that are incredibly intertwined. And I think, especially coming from a background where I was through school meals growing up and looking where I'm at now, it's something that really fascinates me. So yeah, I'm really, really glad to be a part of this talk, and it's really, really forced me to think about my own background, my own experiences, and how I've gotten to somebody who didn't go abroad until he was 16 to travel in the world on a very frequent basis is something that is always in the back of my mind, I guess.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting because again, at the top of the show, when Tom asked me about cultural capital, I talked about the different levels of privilege that there are, and I think holidays abroad is one of the big ones because it wasn't as big a thing, sort of certainly when I was at school. And where I went to school, hardly any of us went abroad on holiday.
Yeah,
I remember us all being so excited when somebody was going to Florida for the first time because he was the first person we knew who would go on a
yeah,
plane.
yeah,
And so I think it's really cool for us to be having this conversation about that privilege and about what we can do for the kids who are like we were,
yeah,
and don't have those same experiences. Thank you very
absolutely.
much.
Thanks.
All right, I think we have our other two panelists in the chat. So I can see that Olga is logged in as a speaker. Katie, if you could request the mic, that would be good because then we can get you in chatting as well. But Olga, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Olga, hello, it's so nice to meet you.
Okay, nice to meet you all. Thank you for inviting me. It's a
Oh, thank you.
pleasure.
Oh, thank you for being here, especially because you are in Spain right now, I think.
Yeah, I am.
So
Yes.
it's getting late for you.
Not for me. You know that we are Spanish, so we are late leavers,
Aaron, come
so we
on.
enjoy
That's
Getting
right.
living
late for
late.
the Spanish. I used to live in
It's quite
Spain.
early for
They
me.
don't go to
I
sleep.
haven't had dinner yet, so it's quite
They
early.
don't have dinner till
Don't
about
worry.
midnight. They don't start. Yeah.
Eh, we have
Fair
a
enough.
late night. Yeah, yeah.
Oh
Okay.
no. Well, I'm so happy to be here. Why don't you tell us, Olga, a little bit about your teaching experience?
Okay, so my teaching experience, as you can deduce from my accent, I'm a Spanish speaker, but I'm teaching English at an official language school. Okay, this kind of institution is quite new for you,
Okay.
for Europe, because it consists of teaching foreign languages for late teenagers, and there's no age limit. So the
Oh wow.
contest, yes, so the contest we have in a same class. So we usually have classes with multicultural background, but not only from different countries, but also from different ages. So the students have different interests for learning a language, or I don't know. I mean, the mixture of our attitudes towards the language is so different. Their paces, their learning paces are so different, and so we have to try to manage these differences. So still teachers of languages like us, so we have to deal with this kind of cultural differences and age differences at the same time. So I don't know, we don't have anything similar in the UK or not even in another European country, but it's a state school and it's not compulsory at all, but it's quite affordable because you only have to pay a fee at the beginning of the course. It's about 100 euros for the whole year.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah, and you can get a certificate that is official certificate for the country. And it's very, very useful, especially if you're studying like further studies at university, because they give you like extra credits in your studies, or I don't know, it's very useful for our country, but it doesn't have the recognition in other European countries. That's a pity. But this is something we are, yes. So this is something we are fighting for, to be recognized beyond our borders. Okay. So to have an international recognition as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Qualifications is something that I have on the list for us to talk about this evening. So it'll be really good to talk about that and the kind of the internationality of different qualifications, which I do think is very important.
Very important. Yes, it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm very excited. Spanish is not a language that I speak. It's not a language that I've studied, and so I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Olga, and to learn more about the Spanish system.
Okay, so it will be a pleasure.
Thank you, thank you. And Katie, are you there?
Hiya, good evening.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Oh, thank you for coming back. I'm glad
My
I
pleasure.
didn't put you off last time.
No, not at all.
So for those who were not tuned into the last one, Katie, do you just want to explain a little bit about yourself and your role at Pearson?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Katie Lewis, and I'm the head of MFL at Pearson EdExcel. So my team and I are the people who've been developing the new GCSEs for French, German and Spanish for first teaching in 2024. I can't remember if the French one was accredited the last time we spoke, but it may have been. But the French one now being accredited, and the German and Spanish hopefully shortly to follow. So we've been pulling those qualifications together, and obviously, you know, thinking about the different levels of cultural experiences, cultural capital, however you want to kind of term that our learners are going to have, is one of the aspects of the new qualification that we've been really very, very mindful of, and trying to kind of find ways to address that.
Absolutely. And I think, like I said in the last one, I think you've done a very good job with that, to be honest, just from looking at the spec and looking at the sample assessment materials. As I said, I do feel that it is a very inclusive exam, this new one. And I'm really excited to see the kinds of things that we can come up with to help to teach that inclusivity, now that we can teach that for the exam purposes.
Yeah, definitely. No, I appreciate that. It's one of those things where you think, I'm sure there are things we could do better. I'm sure that there will be people who are part of the panel, people who are listening, who would have kind of suggestions and kind of ideas as to how we could push that further. And I definitely am open to hearing what those are. But definitely that balance between hitting those two sometimes potentially challenging, contradictory things, where on the one hand you're learning about a language, a culture, of some countries of which you might not have very much experience, if any experience, and sometimes the activities are situated in cultural context that you may not have any experience of at all, let alone in a foreign country, versus the great kind of benefit that languages have to take you outside of your own experiences and perhaps any limitations therein, and broaden your mind, open your horizon. So trying to strike the fine line between doing those two things is really tricky. So I'm really interested to hear everybody's perspectives on that this evening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's going to be a really, really good discussion. So once again, before we get into the meat of it, I want to thank all four of you, Fiona, Adam, Olga, and Katie, for joining us. And of course, to all of you who are listening, either listening in live or who are listening back as a podcast, thank you for joining us too. Please do continue to join in the conversation. Even if you are listening back as a podcast, you can always tweet me directly at Mr. D. Lester. You can tweet the TT Radio official account, or of course, you can engage with Pearson. Pearson themselves are very active on Twitter, which I very much like as a teacher. And let's keep the conversation going, because I am sure that the hour and a half that we have left now is not going to be enough. I think what I'd like to do to start with is going to be a little bit like circle time. I think to begin with, it's going to be the primary school teacher in me coming out, because I want to check that we're kind of all on the same page when it comes to what we mean by cultural capital and what we mean by cultural chasm. So Tom asked me this question at the top of the show, and I explained that for me, cultural capital is the access to different cultural artifacts, I suppose, objects, be it theatre, dance, television, food, and then the chasm, the gap. I joined two words together there. That's kind of where the privilege comes in, and privilege is of all kinds. It's not just about money, as we will discuss, and it's about how we make sure that our students who don't always have access to culture are able to get that. So, Katie, if I start with you, we'll go backwards. Have you got a different interpretation of cultural capital? Have you got anything to add?
I agree with you in terms of that is a very valid definition of cultural capital. But I think for me, it's almost a bit more rooted in perhaps cultural experience or lived experience and knowledge. So
Okay,
by that I mean something like, I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective of exam building or specification
of course.
building. I've always got that slightly sort of practical practical head on. So, you know, for example, a scenario in which students have to imagine themselves, you're an exam rubric kind of situation, you're on holiday in France. Well, you've
Yeah.
immediately therefore set a context for which some students have experience and some students don't. So some students can immediately picture themselves, remember that experience, relate to that experience, and some students can't. And even simple things like that in and of themselves can be potentially exclusionary in terms of the student's ability to mentally access the framework of the question. And then it'll go further and it'll say, you're going to book a table in a restaurant, or you're going to book a room in a hotel, or perhaps it's an article that you have to read about a festival or some traditions in a target language speaking country. And if you can create for yourself a memory, I think that somehow gives you a bit of a leg up in terms of the access to that material, which has really got nothing to do with your language skills and everything to do with your life experiences. So for me, the cultural capital chasm, and we created a mouthful for you there, I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
The cultural capital chasm is the gap between the experience levels of the different learners in the classroom or the different learners in the exam room. And anything that we can do to bridge that gap is trying to put them on the same level, trying to put them on the same page so that they have as equitable an experience of the content and the assessment as possible.
Now that's really interesting, actually, that you've come at it from that point of view, because I do quite often see students, you know, when we're doing past papers or when we're mocking up, particularly the longer writing questions, and you give them a scenario like you're writing to your pen friend, you're writing a blog post. Sometimes they get so in their heads about what a blog post looks like or what a pen friend is, that they find it difficult to start. So I like this idea that we're almost removing a cognitive layer. We're lightening that cognitive load to kind of jump on the bandwagon there, and giving them these experiences, like you said, so they've got a memory that they can draw from.
Exactly. Even if that memory might be one that you've created in the classroom rather than one that they've had, at least, or it's one that we've perhaps recreated in the exam paper with a picture, for example. At least it's going some way to bringing the children all onto a similar page.
Yes.
Well, to a certain extent, anyway, with obvious limitations.
Of course, of course. No, I like that. I like that perspective. That's already given me a lot to think about. Thank you. Olga, how about you? How do you understand this idea of cultural capital?
From the Spanish point of view, I think for us it's much easier than for an English-speaking country, okay? Because we are continuously bombarded by the English cultural background. Okay, so it's pretty easy to, I don't know, to listen to the music in the original language, So yeah, watching TV series or films, yes, in original language as well. But as language teachers, this is what we need to create, like a natural and culturally diverse content inside our classes, and using real resources, real life resources, and in creating a positive and inclusive classroom environment. Okay, so this is what we usually tend to do. I mean, for example, in my classes, I tend to use games in which you can create a relaxed atmosphere between different students, so they don't feel like they are learning as a hard process. So we need to create this kind of relaxing atmosphere, so they feel like they can feel they are enthusiastic about learning the language. But as the previous speaker said, I mean, sometimes it's quite hard. I mean, because it's difficult to find the real context depending on the language you're teaching. For example, in the language schools, it's harder to find passionate learners of other languages like German or French, because we are really influenced by the English language as such. Okay, so that's it. I mean, we need to find authentic material, try to stimulate with real life simulations, creating dynamic classes all the time. So it's like we are like magicians in a way. Okay, so I'm not a native speaker, but I'm trying to do my best and to keep updated with the latest news and so on. I don't know.
I think that itself, though, is really important, because I also am not a native speaker of the languages that I teach, and I think it can be good for our students to see non-native
Mhm.
speakers communicating in their other language, and I think it's good for them to see that we have to do this work as
Mhm.
well, that we have to, like you say, keep up to
Yeah,
date. And
continuously. Mhm.
um, absolutely, I think it can be good for us to kind of act as role models in that way, and that is one way, I suppose, that we can bridge the gap, we can bridge this chasm, is by setting a good example for
Mhm.
our students.
Yes, yes, creating that this gap is can be overcome, and that's it. I mean, we have to create this link between the teacher and the students and the cultural background. Okay, so there shouldn't be any diversity. I mean, problem. This, I
Yeah.
mean, it's easier because language is culture. So it's impossible just to teach grammar and vocabulary or any linguistic structure such without any cultural background. Okay. Yeah.
Olga, you have taken the words right out of my mouth. I think you are my new teacher best friend.
Okay. Thank you.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
Or Fiona, how about you? Have you got anything to add to what Katie and Olga have said?
I mean, one thing I would say is it's back to the whole idea of treating each learner in your classroom as an individual, which is something that the best teachers do, where I think it can be very easy to sort of stereotype or prejudge what kids might know and what they might not. Because in front of you, you'll have a child who speaks another language at home and brings all that rich culture to the classroom. It might not be Spanish, but it's incredibly relevant because they've already had the experience of being bilingual. You'll have another child who might never have been on holiday abroad, and you can kind of think, oh, how are you going to get on with this? But they're an absolute expert on the South American football players or Spanish football players, and they bring all that to the party. And I think that's the thing, that it's finding the hook. I hope my sound's okay. It feels like really echoey now. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine. You're
Oh, I've
fine.
just got an echo. Yeah, so I think it's finding that hook and sort of thinking, well, you're all different, and what are you bringing, so that you don't have those gaps there. Because I remember sort of, with a child saying, oh, do they speak Spanish, do they speak Mexican in Mexico, and you're saying, well, no, they actually speak Spanish there. And you'll have some children who don't know any cities in South America, and they don't really understand that Spanish is spoken there and why. And I'm coming at it with my lens, where I was very lucky growing up that I did probably have all those experiences of, the cultural capital that we might think of, and knew Evita, for example, the musical, and say, oh, have you heard of Evita? Because, Buenos Aires, Argentina. And they're saying, no, I don't know what you're talking about. So you have to find another angle. You have to say, well, how about, Maradona? And they're like, yes, Mano de Dios. And they know what that is, the hand of God. And so for me in my classroom, it's always like covering absolutely everything of all types of culture, from your kind of, your Spanish flamenco guitar music to football to reggaeton, until you find something that sticks, and not prejudging what a child might know or not know, but making sure that every child will at least come out of the first few years of Spanish knowing a lot more about the conquistadores, and where Spanish, why it is spoken in South America, and the Arabic influence in Spain. And because that's your job really, is to give them, open their horizons regardless of their starting points, because you don't know which of those children is then going to explore that further. And that's the gap for me, that if you don't do that, and you don't let those children have that access to the culture, that's inherently the gap.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Fiona, what you've just explored is individualized, differentiated learning at its core, isn't it? It's not about different colored worksheets for your different attainment levels. It's about making sure that they are learning what they want to learn, that they're learning what they're interested in. So yeah, I really like
away.
that.
I think once we get into these debates about cultural capital, it can be quite, you can get into prejudice, and and thinking it's got to all be concierto de Aranjuez, which I do. I mean, with A level, we absolutely will look at that, and that music, and the Alhambra, and I sometimes will show it to younger students. But it's about accepting that what interests you and what interests a young student in front of you might not be the same thing, and there's all different types of culture. It's not about, it doesn't have to be high level, and it can be, but it could be as simple as chorizo. Has anyone seen that? Oh, I've seen that in the supermarket, miss. I know what that is. And that's amazing, because you're in, then you've got the hook. And I think it's about being very, very open-minded about what culture means to students, because it might not mean the same thing as it does to you. And think about what your ultimate point is. I mean, you're there to teach them a language so that they can communicate, obviously. You're there to open doors to them. And as Katie's mentioned, that, the exams are not there to prevent students from doing well because they don't know that Martinique is a French-speaking colony. But then on the resources, with my resources hat on, and what teachers want, because we've asked them in research, is they want that rich culture. They want to open their students' horizons. But we just need to be careful that, my lens on it will be very different to a student sitting in my class from a very different background. I mean, I had access to books and resources, and was taken to France camping at an early age, and went on a German exchange trip, but not all students have access to those things. I'm sure we'll explore how we can help that, but it can be very small. It can be something as simple as trying chorizo for the first time and going, oh, they eat that in Spain. Oh, I see. And why is that? And I think that's the thing. You've got to be really careful not to make it into this grand thing that it doesn't have to be, to still have a really big impact.
Absolutely, because I think sometimes we can fall into the quagmire of fetishizing a culture, and kind of othering a culture by making it this massive thing, and we forget to celebrate it by kind of almost treating it with too much reverence. So I think it's absolutely good to get in at the children's level and find out what they're interested in and celebrate it that way. Right, Adam, how about you? Anything to add?
Maybe I'm going to go a bit off-piste.
That's fine. That's fine.
But I think there's two issues to hand. I think you've got cultural capital and you've got cultural literacy. And for me, these are two very, very separate matters, and two that need to be dealt with really, really carefully.
Okay.
So I did an assembly recently, a whole school assembly throughout the year groups, on culture, and I just thought, oh, I could go down the usual happy clappy, oh, loads of different cultures, lovely, 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 everything's lovely. But I thought, no, actually, that would be the easy way to do it. But I decided to look at culture, what it entails, and how we can be more inclusive. And I think, relating to my experience, you've got obviously cultural capital. And if we look at the term cultural capital, you've got the word capital. And I said to the kids, anything that involves capital involves money. It involves a kind of currency. And I said, look, if I go to Selfridges with a 20 quid note, sorry, I'm sounding really jolly here, but this is me being me. If I go to Selfridges with a £20 note and I try and buy a pair of whatever the brand is that's in at the minute jeans, not a hope in hell's chance have I got of buying those jeans, because I haven't got that amount of capital, I haven't got that amount of money. And for me, there's this value judgment when we look at cultural capital that comes alongside it. And I think a part of this kind of my understanding of cultural capital as well comes down to my other half. He's an architect. And he threw me, when I said I was doing this assembly, he threw me Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. I was like, oh, good God. But it was an interesting read. And after I digested it, obviously you've got this value judgment, and you have to ask yourself, who is it that is actually placing these judgments on what is deemed to be the legitimate culture, the high society, and who's been in other cultures off as being not worth enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to come about it. But then we have to look at the learners that are in front of us. And I think Fiona hit the nail on the head with what she said, in terms of, for instance, if we want this change to come about, then what we actually have to do is probably arm our students that we've got in front of us now with what's deemed as being high culture, and the ability to think, to therefore then challenge it, and to look at cultural literacy and bring in that acceptance. And I mean, I look at my own experiences. The only way I could get out of the Northeast, I guess, and get to London, where I'm at now, is by arming myself with what I needed to succeed at university, what was the done thing, how to study. Those are skills that, for instance, you need certain experiences in life to go through to arm yourself with those skills. And I think that really, really altered my understanding of cultural capital. And it's something that I've got in the back of my head, that cultural capital is a thing, it does exist, and people do place value judgments. You just have to go around the museums and look what's on display in museums to realize that cultural capital is very, very real, and this value judgment is very, very much there. But then we have, and for our students to make that social mobility, to have that happen, we have to arm them with certain experiences. But we also have to arm them with that capability of being sensitive enough to engage with conversation, and to listen to others' experiences, and to interact in dialogue, and to think about how we're going to change that paradigm. And it's a paradigm shift. It's not just something that we can do overnight. And that's what I think, in the back of my mind, is really, really important. And it starts by looking at resources. It starts by looking at, maybe, for instance, if we're talking about perceptions of certain people from certain origins, are we always portraying sports people as being really strong, or people of certain ethnicities as being really strong, when actually there's amazing scientists, amazing mathematicians from different backgrounds, and we have to kind of drip feed it in, but also arm them with the knowledge, the students with the knowledge, that actually that's going to allow them to access university level study, that's going to allow them to access those positions of power, that they can really make those kind of decisions and change their views in the future, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's really good. And I don't think that was off piste at all, Adam. I think what you've done is drawn quite nicely together what everyone has said. Because there are very clearly these two strands. There's the what we used to call cultural knowledge and understanding, the CKU, as it used to be back in the primary languages ladder bit. So the learning about culture of the target language speaking countries. But then there is, as Katie said at the beginning, there's that ability to empathize, to manufacture situations, so that when you personally are sitting in an exam and you need to write about going to London Fashion Week, you're able to imagine that. You're able to create that for you. And I suppose the more diverse experiences we are able to give our students, the more able they are to do both.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Completely agree.
That's really interesting. And I love that we spent about 20 minutes just defining our terms. That's going to make all my lecturers at university very, very happy, I think. I wanted to pick up though, and I'm taking my primary school teacher hat off now, so I'm just going to kind of throw this open. So feel free, any of you, to weigh in if you've got something to say. But I wanted to pick up on this idea of kind of high culture and low culture, because I was thinking about this with my anime club this evening. It was my last session with them, and we watched some Junji Ito. And Junji Ito is a very well-respected Japanese mangaka, comic book creator, who does quite a lot of horror. And what struck me as I was watching it with my club was that it's freely available on Netflix. We were not watching on Netflix; we were watching on DVD. But his work is available on Netflix, so it's accessible. It's very popular in Japan. It's pop culture in Japan. It's things that my students in Japan of my students' age would be reading. So it's the authentic materials, like Olga was talking about before. But because it's pop culture, it's not quite seen as important as if we had been learning about the haikuists, or if we had been looking at Journey to the West, the four great novels of Asian literature. And that got me to thinking about how when we think about cultural capital, we do tend to think about the highbrow culture and kind of leave the lowbrow popular culture behind, even though that tends to be what our students relate to, and it's kind of what our students like.
I mean, this is like a question of psycholinguistics, I guess,
There.
in my eyes. And I remember when I was living in Russia, obviously Russian
Yeah, I was just going to come in
situations.
there and just say I agree about the sort of high and low culture where I think often there's a place for all of it. And if you start with something like reggaeton, for example, where that was when I noticed a massive change in my Spanish teaching, when that song Despacito came out however many years ago, like 6 years, and I was suddenly getting kids, and my last few schools have been very mixed catchment areas, kids of all socioeconomic backgrounds really, and kids were kind of shouting at me as I walked across the school, have you heard that song, miss? What does that mean then? And they were so interested. And then you start to they want to look at video clips of reggaeton, and you're kind of thinking, some of these are not particularly appropriate, and you get into discussions of machismo, and why are a lot of the girls in these clips not wearing a lot of clothing, and is that okay? Is it not okay? Is it fun? Is it just a party? And I think actually, like Rosalia Malamente was another one that all the kids were asking me to play, and the icons of Spain that she uses in the video are just so interesting, and what she does with that, and the discussions you can get into. So there's absolutely a place for all types of culture in a classroom. I don't really buy this kind of high and low culture. I was looking into some of the links that Adam mentioned before, and I found this thing cultural omnivore. And a cultural omnivore is someone who will go to the theatre but then watch reality TV, and I'm completely that person. Like, I shamelessly do talk about Hola magazine and my obsession with Spanish royalty and gossip, but they know I also love other aspects of Spanish culture. So I think it's really important that we have all of it in our classrooms.
Oh, I love that. I love the idea of a cultural omnivore. I'm seeing a display already. My whole classroom is going to be changed tomorrow around this theme. I like that. I like that. Adam, you were saying about your time in Russia.
Yeah, I think it comes down like what Fiona's just said in terms of cultural omnivores and what's deemed as being high class and low class. And I remember being in Russia, and one of my psycholinguistics projects at final year was on something that was called "Давайте говорить правильно," which means like let's speak properly. And it was all this idea of the rejection of borrowings from Europe.
Ooh.
So one of them, for instance, and you would be sat on the St. Petersburg metro, and you would see, for instance, what was it? Image Niet Obras was being like the proper version. And obviously, it just sounds to us like high culture, low culture in terms of what Fiona's just said as well. But what these people are actually doing, and this kind of value judgment actually does, and especially by a St. Petersburg kind of member of Senate actually did, was it was turning the political tension back on Moscow. What it was almost like a re-Russification, I guess. And I think this is
Ah,
something that's always at the back of my mind is kind of what kind of cultural things are going on and how is this putting the political, how is this changing the political balance, I guess. And that's just something that really, really stuck with me. And I think psycholinguistics and how we go talking about um, like the rejection of borrowings. We look at what's going on in France. I was talking to somebody at the ALL a couple of weeks ago, and the term cultural, sorry, not cultural capital, decolonizing the curriculum doesn't
yes.
even exist in France. I
No,
mean, it just goes to show you, it shows you what the political motives are of a place, of a country at that time. And I think it's just really, really important to have that at the back of your brain at all times.
absolutely. It's almost like the weaponization of culture, I suppose. And we see it even here in the UK. We see people trying to turn Britishness into a some kind of umbrella term that encompasses everybody. When in fact we have wherever you are in the UK, there are different types of culture. There are people of different cultures.
Absolutely, and it almost brings in the question, why have Ofsted used the term cultural capital? It does
Yep,
actually raise that question in my mind a lot of the time.
absolutely, absolutely. That is an interesting one. If we've got anybody from Ofsted listening in, who would like to let us know why you've used cultural capital, we're not critiquing the use of the term, of course, because we're using it right here on the show. But I would be interested, as I'm sure Adam would as well, to know why you've used that, because that's a very personal
Can I ask
question.
the significance of that question? Just from my perspective, what's the angle on that?
I mean, I guess Tom comes. Like, you talking to me, Tom? Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Yeah. Sorry. I think it's just a case of, for instance, almost I want to know is there a political element behind it? Why that term was specifically included? You only have to look at documentation. You look at the rewording of, for instance, keeping children safe in education 2023 versus last year.
Mm.
You notice these little language changes, and in the back of my mind, I guess this is how I've been a psycholinguist. I always what runs through my mind is like, what is the political agenda behind the wording of that? Is there a reason why they've used the term cultural capital when we know that cultural literacy, for instance, being able to be open to others' experiences, share those experiences, being able to converse and participate in dialogues. I, I just guess I want to know, is there a political motive behind it? Was there something to do with maybe powers that be imposing an agenda? I don't know. This is just me talking really, really candidly now, but yeah.
I think it is always with any change that happens in education, it is always good to think about what the motive behind the change is. Um, and of course, as language teachers, we want to kind of exploit the change as much as we can to share the cultures of the countries that we love, of the languages that we love. It's like Olga said before, you can't understand a language without understanding the people who speak it. And so I think it's good from my perspective that they brought this idea of cultural capital in. But then, Adam, I agree with you that there is this political, almost like a shadow to it, about that phrasing, about cultural capital versus cultural
Absolutely.
literacy.
And is it a term that has been used incorrectly? Have they not really done the background reading to it, or is it like, do you know what I mean? It's for me that's a little bit worrying.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I think that's a whole other show. I'm going to talk to you, Adam, because maybe I can have you on a Saturday morning, and we can discuss this a bit more because I think that'll be really interesting.
If I'm not running down the canals, you most
Oh,
certainly can.
this is true. Olga, I would be interested in your perspective now, because from my point of view, as someone who is taught in countries in Europe and in Asia, which are not Spain, um, English speaking culture, particularly American culture, has always been quite cool and quite fashionable. Is
Mhm.
that something that you're still finding with particularly your young people?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have teenagers in our classes, and they usually become the teachers of this kind of situations. Okay, so sometimes I'm not able to explain who is the Instagrammer, whoever's it called, or the latest or the most fashionable TikToker, or even myself. I'm in my 40s already, so I'm a bit lost sometimes. And this is an advantage, having teenagers mixed completely with adults over 40s, 60s, and they become the teachers, and they're able to explain these new ways of communicating. And I don't know, it's very funny sometimes, okay? And but the reality, I mean, for example, like people from Spain or from Southern America, I don't usually follow, and for me it's quite difficult to understand, especially Rosalia. I can't understand the lyrics at all. So the accent is completely different from mine in the Spanish.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's cultural mixture we usually tend to have in our classes. It's so positive, it's so amazing. And I don't know, you should be there in our classes, because this is something that is quite special from our schools. Okay, then there's no age limit. So I don't know, they all become teachers. Okay, so the adults can teach about the cultural background, the way they used to study, and the way the teenagers usually communicate nowadays. So it's very funny. Okay.
I like that. I like that very much, and I love the idea of your teenagers teaching
Yeah.
the older people about, because that is something. Again, as a non-native speaker of the languages that I teach, and not coming from the cultures of the languages that I
Mhm.
teach, I do find it quite difficult sometimes to keep up with what's going on
Yeah.
in youth culture in those countries. Quite often I have a native speaker colleague in French, and so I can go and ask her who are the popular YouTubers in France, and she will
Mhm.
tell me people to talk about. But I need to kind of actively remember to do the same to my Japanese friends, my Chinese friends, to try and keep up, um, which I think sometimes can be quite difficult for us as the teachers to kind of keep up with how quickly culture changes.
Yeah, and the students feel more motivated and more, I don't know, it's like they feel more safe, or they feel safer when they speak about their own tastes. Okay,
Yes,
so they are able to explain in a different language something they are really interested in. Okay, so I don't know, they feel quite more motivated explaining what they really like or what they really love. Okay, so it's a different way of accepting a new language.
absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's really important. And so, Katie, actually, I have a question for you now, because obviously a lot of the culture things we have talked about so far today, music and film and TV and stuff, they are not um, discrete units on the GCSE curriculum, in the same way that they are at A level, for example. So, from your perspective, kind of as both as a teacher and as um, a very important person at Pearson, um, what are the best ways that we can kind of be combining these things, that we can get our students thinking about the culture, thinking about the music and the theatre and the books and the TikTokers, but in a way that also will benefit them when they're sitting in the exam room?
I think that the point that perhaps Olga and everyone has been making is that in order for students to really enjoy their language learning experience, it has to feel like something that's engaging, it has to feel like something that's relatable, and any cultural content has to be something which brings that language to life, because as someone has already rightly said, there isn't really any language outside of culture anyway. So what we really ideally want in that kind of classroom experience, and not just for GCSE but just for sort of secondary language learning in general, is that a student's cultural interest or cultural knowledge, or indeed lack thereof, or lack of experience of some of these things, isn't an active barrier. And so long as it isn't an active barrier, so long as they can explore the vocabulary requirements, to be again back to my practical exam hat on, so long as
Of
they can
course.
explore the vocabulary requirements of what they're going to be doing for their exam, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter either way whether they explore that through the lens of, popular culture, whether they explore it through the lens of literature, whether they explore it through the lens of uh, pop music, whatever it might be, TikTok, whatever it might be, because it's just the engagement with the language, the having the fun and the using of that language, and not feeling that there's a distance between the language that they need to understand and produce and what they're going to be expected to do. And then it's the exam's job to a certain extent, and it kind of sounds weird when I say this. I think it's not the exam's job to try and be interesting or to try and be the place where something surprising and challenging happens. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like fun and surprising, engaging, unexpected content is totally brilliant in the classroom, but it's totally unnecessary in the exam. In the exam, it's just nothing except your ability to get the language that you know down on the page or out of your mouth or in through your ears. That's all we need, really. And then we have to it's really hard, I think, not to reflect on your own experiences as a young person learning languages and thinking about what Adam was saying about cultural capital and high culture and the social value that we put in all of those things. It's really absolutely true. And I sort of reflect back on what it was like for myself as a sort of a person who didn't necessarily grow up with that kind of high culture background. I didn't go on an aeroplane until I was, I think, in my early 20s. The first time I left the country was on my school exchange, my German school exchange in probably year 10 or year 11. So then going to university and being exposed to people who had long kind of histories of a different kind of cultural experience that I had never had, and being made aware, I guess. I don't know whether it was through my own sort of self-consciousness or through anything kind of any sort of tacit judgment more so than any sort of explicit judgment, but being very aware very quickly that I didn't have some of those sort of same cultural reference points that some of my peers at the university evidently did, and perhaps were quite happy to sort of show off about a little bit, maybe. But we don't have to do all of those things in the MFL classroom. I feel like what we perhaps have to do is remove the barriers that make a language learning experience something that kids feel isn't relatable or isn't engaging or isn't fun. And then once they've started on that language learning journey, once they've shown that they can have success, they felt that they can have success, perhaps through their exam experience or through their classroom experience, then the other elements of the world of wider culture and so on, those can all be built up over time. But if you have that as a pre-existing barrier to them even being able to get on to get on with language learning in the first place, you've almost kind of failed before you've started. And some of that more intensive cultural growth that they might go through, perhaps that some of that can come along later, so long as we don't build that barrier right from the get-go.
Absolutely. As you were talking there, Katie, I've made so many notes because I loved everything that you said. I agree completely that the exam is not the place for something new and scary, because the point is for our students to be able to show off what they know,
Totally.
not what they don't know. So that's perfect. And I love that you opened with the idea of us using this in the lessons, because I know so many teachers who, because of the culture of judgment that quite often happens in the classroom around exam results, so many teachers will teach to the exam. And so will not think of how to teach the vocabulary through the music or the films or whatever, but will teach through the PowerPoints because they know that that works. That it's been successful in the past. So it's nice for you to kind of remind us of how important that is.
Definitely. It is one of the potential positive changes that and I'm not sort of saying this from a big, Pearson perspective, but just thinking about it from the subject criteria themselves and having this vocabulary-led approach, something that gets away from themes, although you can group the vocabulary via thematic context should you so choose. Really, the most important thing and the only thing that you have to do to make sure that students are well prepared is cover the vocabulary list and cover the grammar list. Now, if there are ways in which you can do that and also bring in a lot of the stuff that our other colleagues who know better about it than me have been talking about, there is absolutely nothing to stop you doing that anymore. You don't have to teach the environment or whatever it might be as a topic, or recycling as a topic. You can do anything that you want to do to a certain extent in order to get those words into the students, get them using them over and over again so that they feel comfortable with them in whatever context then they might come upon them, either in the exam or indeed in their language speaking life.
Excellent, excellent. Which ultimately is what a qualification in a language should be all about. I want to pick up on a word that Katie used quite often just then, and that word is barrier. We've talked about the barrier, the financial barrier, I suppose, quite often. You know, we've talked about whether students do or don't go abroad on holiday and all of that sort of things. But what other barriers are we seeing in the classroom at the moment? I'm just throwing that out to anybody who has any ideas.
I was just going to chip in. I'll actually chip in at the right moment. I apologise. I think I butted in before on Adam's Russian. I'm gutted I missed that. My connection's going because I have multiple teenage children on multiple devices.
Oh, understandable.
I do apologise for coming in earlier. I was just, I mean, I think a barrier that, it's not a time to get into politics, but obviously, the school funding situation is obviously really, really difficult when it comes to things like this, because obviously Katie mentioned going on her school exchange, and that's how I became a linguist in the first place. I went on an exchange trip to Germany with an amazing teacher, and that sowed the seed, and I'm in touch with her now, and that's 35 years later, 40 years later, because she just took us on this trip. And I think for schools, exchange trips are a much more economically valid way to take kids abroad, because a lot of these organized trips that we've probably all done as language teachers are so expensive. And I've tried to get funded places for pupil premium students before, and the school have only been able to offer a third. Well, that's no use to some families. It would have to be the whole place funded, and I think schools are actually generally really supportive of MFL. I've worked with lots of amazing senior leadership teams who are really champion it, and you want to get visitors in, and if you can get visitors in for free who'll come and talk to your kids about culture. And we've had amazing visiting Japanese groups who've put on kabuki plays in English for our kids, which has been incredibly inspiring. But there is just this money thing, and obviously another thing is Brexit and the whole issue with school exchanges, where the British Council are incredible, and they're the ones to reach out to. There's the Global Alliance, are amazing as well, and there's the touring scheme. But I would say, as a head of languages, what I would have really valued is more support with some of the admin, because once you started to have to get DBS checks for exchanges, it was just incredibly difficult. And schools can't afford to pay for cover, so staff are having to go on trips in their holidays, which I've done it many times myself. But if you've got a very hardworking head of languages, you should be protecting their holidays ideally, so they're fresh to get back and do the amazing job they do teaching languages. So I just think the money side of things is very, very difficult for schools now, and you have to be incredibly creative and find ways to get the culture across. But one thing I was going to say as a positive, so I think that's a barrier, but there are positives, because when I was thinking, when Katie was talking about effectively bringing the language into the classroom, that's what it's all about, giving them that exposure. When I started teaching, I mean, it was all realia, you literally were there with your metro tickets and your posters and jumping around with your little bag of trips. MFL teachers had a reputation, for kind of running around laden down with things like, look, I've brought Germany into the room. And now you can just do it at the click of a button. I mean, it's magical that if the kids are interested in Camp Nou in Barcelona, you can literally say, let's go on Google Maps and have a look at it. Right, there's the Retiro Park in Madrid. Look, they're rivals, Real Madrid. And you can totally bring it alive in the most incredible way that isn't doesn't cost any money. You don't have to get them to the country. You know, I think that is a massive advantage. And, you know, in lockdown, I was asked to teach Spanish to a group of kids who had never done Spanish because they were a mixed key workers group. And I was able to find stuff at the touch of a button on fair trade bananas, and we did that. And then we looked at street food, and I downloaded videos, and we downloaded paella recipes. And, you know, if I'd had the wherewithal, we would have done some cooking, but, you know, it wasn't very practical. But I think that's the positive. There are a lot of barriers, and money is a massive one for schools, but there are creative solutions. And I think the more help and support that MFL teams can get in schools to lay on all these incredible things, whether it's financial or just time, just give them time to do all this, because it takes forever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, the internet can be an incredible resource for us. It's one of the reasons why I loved teaching during lockdown. I don't make a secret of that, because we were forced to be online. And so all of a sudden I was able to remember things like using Google Maps that I might not necessarily do when I'm in the classroom, because I feel like I need to be standing at my board with my PowerPoint. But it was that the creativity that came, and finding all of these things that can help to bridge that gap, that don't need to cost the earth. Although, you know, if the government would like to fund one-to-one devices for our students, I think that would be good for all subjects, not just MFL. I think there would be across the board improvements. But yeah, no, I agree. Money and time is another really interesting one. I think you're absolutely right. The number of teachers, heads of departments I've seen spending too much time on entering passport details into websites, into, you know, sending them to the British Council, or going on the recce visit during their own time off,
Booking
because they're not
flights.
allowed to go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
booking flights yourself and being responsible for getting all that right. And it's difficult because so schools are under pressure, and, you know, they do want to support, but I think, you know, there is certainly, there's a lot of mileage in getting a lot more support with that, because, you know, heads of languages come in September, and the first thing is day of languages, and it's like, well, every day is a
yes,
language day. But, you know, there are some serious time issues behind organizing that, because it's brilliant to get the canteen up and running with World Food Days, but it all takes time. And you know, a head of languages will have a very packed curriculum to teach as well as supporting their staff. So I think everything that can be done to support teams in that organizational side is massive, because there's no lack of creativity. MFL teachers are the most creative bunch ever, and they will find
yes.
ways, you know, whether it's like slightly illegally taking your sixth form students to see an Almodovar film without the proper checks. And I'm not condoning that. I mean, absolutely, you need to get permissions to take your
Of
kids to do
course.
anything. But I have casually met sixth form at the cinema in the past who just happened to be there to watch an
Oh,
Almodovar film.
coincidence.
And I mean, obviously, that doesn't apply to younger students. And when you're organising trips, you have to do it all properly. And that's why I'm saying all the paperwork has to be in place. But, you know, we do want to get the kids to the country if we can. And not all families can afford that. And they need support. The more support they can get so we can do that, the better. But there are ways to do it in school as well. But money and time is an issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Olga, what do you feel in Spain? Do you think that there are any big things that stop you from being able to get your students to access English speaking culture?
I'm not really sure about that, because the type of institution that I'm ruling right now is not compulsory studies. So, but I think from a mother's perspective or from a mother's point of view,
Absolutely.
I feel that we don't have we have kind of grants to guarantee that some of our students can have this kind of exchanges with other countries and other students. But I still feel that it's quite expensive to send your kids abroad. When I studied English at the school, I wasn't able to travel abroad. It was quite expensive. I couldn't afford it. So my first experience in a foreign country was when I decided to work abroad. And that's where I really learned what English was, culturally speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so working as a waitress, I work as an au pair. So I remember once well, my first experience there was terrible because I traveled to Liverpool, and I always heard that the accent from my teachers was completely different from Liverpool.
Yes.
So I thought that
Olga,
I
you
was
know
living in
what's
another country.
quite funny is when you started that sentence, you said, I had a really terrible experience. I travelled to Liverpool. I just thought you were gonna.
No,
I
no.
genuinely thought you were just gonna leave it there, and
No,
we were
no, no.
gonna
I
move
know.
on.
I remember. For me, it was a terrible experience. Not traveling to Liverpool, but the situation that I had to leave, because I remember that I couldn't understand a word of English for 15 days. For 15 days, I was totally desperate, and then I realized that I was starving. I needed to start to speak and to express myself and to communicate with people. And suddenly, okay, I became fluent. I was able to understand the words that my family expressed, and it was the best experience that I ever had. Okay, so I meant that it's necessary to travel to another country. Yes, I know, but I mean it's not always possible for all the families. And fortunately in Spain we have lots of grants for many families, and I really felt that they need to experience this kind of trips. Okay, but there should be more aids to help families and kids and so on. For example, in our schools, we are usually promoting this kind of trips, but we don't have grants for them. Okay, but and most of our students are adults, so they can usually afford it, and then they usually join us in this kind of trips. We usually travel together, but independently. It's not like a school trip as such. Okay, that they all depend on the teacher. So they are adults traveling together, and yes, because these kind of trips are usually for over 18, so they have to, because it's their responsibility. It's not the teacher's responsibility to look after them. Okay. And I don't know, now we have contacts with some other institutions abroad, so they can travel not only for learning the language while exchanging their experiences with other families, but also they can go there and work as au pairs, or I don't know, it's completely perspective from our schools. But we try to bring guests from different countries, so they can talk to our students about different cultures, about any custom that they find interesting to share with them. Okay, so that's what I can say about this.
No, that's really interesting.
I'm
I
sorry
mean,
for the Liverpool, because I love my family in Liverpool.
I was joking, Olga. I was joking.
Oh, and my second experience was in York. I don't know if it was even
Oh well,
worse.
that's much more posh. So that's York sort of cucumber sandwiches and that. So
Yeah.
very different.
yeah, it's okay, Olga, don't worry. I'm a native speaker and I don't always understand what people from Liverpool say, so it's fine.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson EdXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson EdXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
So we talked a lot then about kind of some of the institutional barriers towards cultural capital. Do we ever feel that the students throw up barriers, or do we think that they are always on board with the culture that we try and teach them?
Can I jump in, Darren? Just like
Oh, of
two
course,
seconds.
Adam. Yeah, sorry.
I think there's like an even more fundamental barrier more than anything
Okay.
else. And I'm just thinking, I used to work in Deep Dark Gateshead. that was a challenge in an adequate school. And I moved down to where I'm at the minute, which is the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
Okay.
But I look at the diversity that's sat in front of me, and when you have materials in front of you, when you have textbooks, and when you have exam papers, and that just don't reflect the students that have got maybe braided hair, and when the students haven't even been taught or don't have materials provided for them that kind of cater for their own, to be able to use themselves to describe their own appearance or their own feelings or their own family setup. I think that for me is the biggest barrier, because if you're going to use a language, you want to talk about yourself. That's, we teach the first person over and over again, and if we are not equipping our students with the right vocabulary to talk about themselves, to describe themselves, then that for me is the biggest issue. And I've got to say, over the past couple of years, I think exam boards have done pulled it out of the bag in terms of being more inclusive. But I remember looking at resourcing and having to do it like completely different resourcing for our kids when we did our last kind of curriculum review for what is the current specification. And it's just so sad that, like, obviously things like trenfitas for boys, like braided hair, trentas, and talking about like families that have got two dads and stuff like that, and that it's not covered in some of the materials. And I know there's different pressures and stuff like that, but if we want the kids to use the language, they need to be able to talk about themselves more than anything else,
I think that is so important. And sorry, I'm just gonna jump straight in after.
No, please
I
do.
think it's so very important, and it resonates with me so profoundly. And one of the things I was saying about the new GCSE having this list of vocabulary and just teach the vocabulary, and that to a certain extent provide some sort of advantage in terms of the approach, it also presents a really significant challenge, exactly in the kind of aspect that Adam's talking about, in terms of if you've got a limited list of words and a limited source for those words, in that they have to come 85% of them from the top 2,000 most frequently occurring words in that language, and that comes from a corpus which is and of itself derived from particular types of sources, then one of the really fundamental challenges that you've got in putting your content together is how to make that content in which all students are able to talk about themselves, their experiences, their family situations, their cultural backgrounds in equal ways, and to be able to see that reflected in the content that's put in front of them. So I'll give you a quick example, just because I think it speaks to that point. So we haven't got the word in our new GCSE for church. In French, I'm talking about here, because within the top 2,000 words in French, obviously the word church is in there, the word Catholic is in there. But we haven't chosen those words to go into the GCSE because the word for temple and the word for synagogue, for example, other places of worship, other religious affiliations, aren't in the top 2,000. So what that means is any word which is on the vocabulary list is a compulsory word that everybody has to learn. And therefore, it could come up in the listening exam, it could come up in the reading exam, in one of the materials that we produce. Now, if you want to learn a word to talk about your own culture, therefore, your own religious background, for example, or indeed if you have no religious background at all, you want to have the word for that, then you're going to have to learn additional words above and beyond the words that your Catholic church-going peers are going to learn. And you're not going to see those words coming up in the reading and the listening papers. So rather than including some and excluding others, we took an approach where, to a certain extent, you could say we excluded them all, but we picked the word for religion, we picked the word for faith, so that students can talk about that aspect of their life in broad and general terms. But if you want to know the specific word for church, you want to know the specific word for Christian, you want to know the specific word for Islam or Muslim or mosque, then everyone who wants to learn that specific word learns that specific word additionally, so that you don't have some people who have to learn about other people's lives and experiences and circumstances. But for me and my life and my experience, I have to learn additionally. So it's things like that around what do you include and what do you exclude that have been really challenging in regards to the way that this new qualification is built. And so I just thought that was really, really important and critical what Adam was saying. So, you know, all the words for different kind of relationships, different kind of parental setups, different kind of family relationships. Those are all included in there. So students can talk about step siblings, half siblings, step parents, same-sex parents, all kinds of different kind of situations of their family life, to really try and make students realize, because I think in a way it speaks to this barrier of the reason that a foreign language is a barrier to me being able to learn it is because it's about somebody else. It's not about me. It's not about
Yes.
my life and my family doing the things that me and my family do. It's about someone else's life, someone else's family, and doing the things that they do, like going on holidays or going skiing, or, you know, all those examples that we could think of. And we need to say, actually, no, your life, your family, your experiences are equally valid, equally recognized, and equally important. And you can bring those experiences to the MFL experience.
I was going to definitely chip in, if that's okay, and just support what Katie's saying, because obviously we have got that challenge, because we are making the resources, and the vocab list is exceptionally challenging. And I think it's totally right what Katie's saying, that in the exam the teachers want to know exactly what's going to be in the reading and listening, and it shouldn't exclude, and nobody should have that barrier in the exam of not having the cultural experience or background to be able to write the 90 words or whatever they're doing. But in our resourcing, we've obviously got to think then about how we deal with that. And, you know, I can't give every bit of detail on it, because it's, you know, when the samples will be with you as soon as we have them. But I would just say that we have thought very carefully about ensuring that those words are very much in our course, so that teachers feel students are really prepared for the exam, because that's what teachers want. They want the students to do well in MFL, but there will be elements of productive vocabulary. I think teachers should feel reassured that just because, you know, the word for mosque or whatever it might be is not in the word list, there will be opportunities for students to do that, because we know that they're going to want to say additional things in their productive skills, in their speaking and writing. And also, just to echo what Adam was saying, I think a lot of thought has been put into DE&I. I think it's absolutely true that you know, the resources have not always been appropriate for a class of children of very different heritages and backgrounds. And I think partly, you know, some of that is just speaks of the times that some of these resources came out. You know, 10, 12 years ago, we weren't having these conversations to the extent we are now, and they're very important conversations. And, you know, we really do want to make sure that, you know, I've taught a child who's in foster care who got really upset when I taught the topic of family, because nothing there spoke to her. So you have to give students opportunities to talk about perhaps a celebrity family, because it might make them feel more comfortable. They don't want to talk about that, but if they do, you have to make sure that you've got the word for adopted, you've got those words. And so I'm really hoping that, you know, teachers will be very pleased, you know, when the resourcing comes out, that it will allow them to support all of their students and have something that's reflective. And just one last thing I was going to say is, rather than this idea of otherness and in the textbooks looking at, oh, in Latin America, that funny place over there, I definitely don't want that, you know. And we are going to have a whole chapter that's rooted in a South American city, where all of the work that you're teaching your students, whatever it might be, you know, my town is done there, to make kids appreciate that, you know, there are different sorts of families and of different ethnic backgrounds living in other cities that are Spanish speaking, going about their daily routine. And that's what we're learning about, you know, and so we're hoping that we're going to have that there as well.
It is funny, isn't it, how, kind of with the exception of Olga's adult learners, the students that we teach are still all within Vygotsky's egocentric zone of proximal development. So they are still quite self-centered, even up to the point that they're at A level, just because that's where they are in their emotional development. And yet, from about year 8 onwards, we do expect them to start talking about other people and kind of ignoring themselves. So it is nice that that we are kind of centering them in their own learning again. I think that's really positive. I also really liked, now that you've explained it, this gap for teachers to kind of fill in with other vocabulary, because I've been on a bit of a journey with the new vocab list over the last couple of weeks. I'm sorry, because as I was reading through, I was picking out all the things that I liked. And I really like that in French, transgender is on the list. But I did notice that cisgender was missing. And I thought, oh, are we othering our transgender pupils at that point by saying that cisgender people are default, and so we need to learn this other word? But actually, now that I've kind of thought about it more over the last few weeks, and Katie and Fiona, as I've listened to your explanations, I've realized that actually what we can do is take that word if it's relevant to the student at hand. If my trans student wants to say my parents are cisgender, and then they can learn that as part of their own personal vocabulary about their lives. And I think that can be a really good way to ground that vocabulary.
I think it's a really good point about othering, and yeah, it might be something that we need to reflect on in terms of the approach that we take to how we put all of this vocabulary together. We've slightly, I suppose it's slightly off topic, but just because we're sort of circling around these
Yeah.
kind of conversations, the approach that we've taken, or the approach that we've tried to take in the creation of the materials that we're using for the sample assessment materials and so on, is this approach usualizing, which people are probably familiar with in terms of an approach to DE&I, as opposed to, I guess, what you were sort of alluding to there, which would be more kind of down the normalizing path, which is to sort of suggest that there's a norm around which everything else is a kind of abnormal, and therefore that's worthy of note or worthy of comment, in a way that kind of white male heterosexuality is never really worthy of comment, because it's just perfectly normal and perfectly standard and all of those kind of things. So we've taken this approach to usualizing, where we're trying to reflect in the materials all the ways in which people can be different, and all the ways in which it's perfectly valid and appropriate for those differences to be manifest, but then to not make those differences in and of themselves the focus. So, for example, there might be two people in a relationship in a text having a conversation about what they've done on holiday, let's say, but they aren't necessarily going to be a man and a woman. They could be two men, they could be two women, for example. I think we've got some examples like that in the sample assessment materials, but that in and of itself is immaterial to the fact of the text being about a pair of people who have gone on a holiday and are talking about that holiday, because you're not drawing that out as something noteworthy, you're just including it as another equally valid kind of relationship setup. So in doing that kind of thing, I think we're trying to take a more inclusive approach, but there are inevitably, I'm almost sure of it, however hard we will have tried, there are almost inevitably going to be exclusions where we may ask, why wasn't that word included? And there are going to be inclusions where we ask, why wasn't that word included? And we're going to have to think about that, because the list in itself, even if we were to take things like family situations or culture out of it and just say, well, everything's culture, isn't it, really? Sports or food, and
Yes.
say, of course those are culture too, but to say, well, why isn't the word I don't know, ping pong on the list, but the word tennis is? It's like, well, you can only fit so many sports, you can only fit so many foods. We had so many I shouldn't say arguments, but they were arguments. We had so many arguments about what was going to be in and what was going to be out, and in the end, the only approach that we could take that felt the most equitable was to try and focus on the shared experience as much as humanly possible. And if there are going to be experiences which are likely to be more unique and distinct, like the religion example that I mentioned, try and create a scenario in which students are all in the same boat. So we all have to learn an extra word, rather than I don't have to, but you do, because I'm the norm and you aren't, to try and get into that position. So all the school subjects that are included are core subjects. So English, maths, science, the target language that you're learning, French, German, Spanish, for example, but not the entire list of possible other school subjects. So that if you're also doing history, geography, D&T, art, food tech, BTECs, health and social care, whatever it might be, you might have to learn those words additionally. And to then try and keep the pathways much more open and broad. So words like apprenticeship, words like further education, words like higher education, words like university. So to employment, that kind of thing, to allow it to be broad so everyone could see themselves reflected in there. But if you really want to get into the specifics, perhaps there's going to need to be a bit of additional vocabulary that teachers are going to have to bring into it.
Yeah, and from an exam point of view, that's kind of the beauty of the relative openness of speaking and writing, the productive skills, because then I know that students don't get accredited. Students don't get credit necessarily for using vocabulary that is not on the list. I've read that
They
somewhere.
don't get extra credit. Yeah, they don't get extra
Yes.
credit, but they would get equal credit.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
obviously
Sorry, I
you
wasn't
don't
clear
want to
about that.
create
Yeah.
you don't want to create a situation where somebody, through dint of having access to additional tuition or whatever it might be, has learned all these extra words, and then they kind of deploy them all over the place and get extra credit. That wouldn't be
Yeah.
fair or appropriate. But if you use words that aren't on the vocabulary list in the productive skills, you would absolutely get equal credit to any of the words which were on the list. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so again, that's a nice way that in the speaking and the writing, we can get our students to center themselves again. If I've got the British ping pong champion in my GCSE German class, then she can learn the word for ping pong.
Exactly.
So yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's really interesting for us to consider. Before I pose my next question, do we have any kind of other points on kind of that equity that we have been discussing? Okay. I mean, I think the other thing that I thought was quite interesting about that I didn't think of until just then, as Fiona and Katie were speaking, was that we've approached this discussion so far from us bringing the students into the culture of the target language, and we're kind of trying to close this chasm by bringing them closer to us. But actually, a lot of what the new GCSE is doing by being so inclusive is bringing us closer into their culture. And granted, it's not necessarily the target language culture, but our students these days are much more aware of things like gender and sexuality and politics and family forms than certainly I was at school. And these are things that are important to young people these days. There are social media accounts dedicated to them, and so I kind of like, just spinning the cultural capital for a moment, I kind of like how we are now being encouraged more than ever to get to know our students' cultures. Even if they are in the same native language speaking country that we're based in.
I mean, I don't know how old everyone else is, because we're mercifully only audio in this scenario. Not, I mean, mercifully from my perspective. I'm sure you're all very visually stunning.
Oh
But
no, I wouldn't go ahead.
it means that we don't know how old one another are. But I'm 45, and it's positively ancient from the perspective of the children in the classroom. Yes. And they are, I think it might have been Olga that was saying earlier, or perhaps Fiona, the resource that the students can offer in terms of their cultural knowledge, their cultural backgrounds, all the experience that they may have, that they can use to culturally enrich the classroom, so that we aren't imposing what we think is necessarily kind of cool or relatable. Yes. To a classroom full of 15-year-olds who will probably just want to die on the spot if I tried to tell them what was particularly cool in French culture. But they are a brilliant resource of cultural experience that we can draw upon, definitely.
You're totally right, Katie, because I'm older than you, and I had an embarrassing moment where I was talking about Netflix and asking the kids to recommend what I should be watching on Netflix to improve my Spanish, because always learning, always curious. And they said, well, I think, Miss, you could probably watch Casa de Papel, you could watch Money Heist, but you're a bit old for Elite, Miss. And I was, gutted. But, they're probably right, to be fair. They're obsessed with Elite, aren't they? And, it's really got to be for GCSE, no younger, because it's probably inappropriate. But, they are pretty cool kids, they know when you're just kind of they know when they're humoring you and going along with you. Like, they will tolerate my endless talking to them about the Spanish royal family, but they have their own ideas now. You know, they have access to things and they know about music in Spanish, and they watch. I mean, Netflix is amazing for talk about cultural capital, and we talked about high and low culture. I have no problem with them watching series in Spanish or French. Lupin's amazing. There's all, I mean, there's all languages available, aren't there, on Netflix? And there's other, I've forgotten the link now. Rosie Goldsmith mentioned it on my podcast episode. There's another free link that teachers can use to access programs from all over the world. And I had an A-level student who was, you know, heading for a D when she should have been getting a B, and she ended up hitting her target by watching endless series in Spanish with Spanish subtitles on Netflix. So yeah, the kids, as you say, Katie, have a much better idea than we do sometimes of how they can access the culture.
Well, even little tiny things like, and we talk about barriers, we were talking about barriers earlier, I think to Adam's point, even very tiny things that when we're putting content together, sorry, I can't get my exam content head off at the moment, but even things like someone mentioned pen pal earlier, and even asking people what their favorite television program is. So we added the word, I think we've got the word for streaming, as opposed to just TV program, because even little things like that, when you're asking students in an exam setting about television programs, just to make it clear that, you know, that might actually in and of itself be slightly exclusive from the student's perspective, because they don't sit and watch the telly. It's not 4 channels all sat around watching the telly with a remote control on a wire anymore. You know, everyone's going to be accessing it via their phones, going to be accessing it via streaming, or they're going to be watching sort of short form sort of videos and video platforms and all of that kind of stuff. So making sure that any way that they can access the target language, as long as, like Fiona says, it's age appropriate, or if it isn't age appropriate, they're doing it on their own time and not encouraged by us, then all of that helps bring that language to life.
Definitely.
It's interesting, isn't it, what culturally we assume our students will know, but they don't. Every year, and I don't know why I forget this, every year I teach my year 9s the French word feuilleton, soap opera. And then I have to try and explain what a soap opera is. And then they've never heard of any of my examples, because it's just not part of their zeitgeist. It's not part of something that they access. So eventually I get to Hollyoaks, and a couple of them understand what I'm talking about. But it's kind of that is part of that chasm, I suppose, isn't it? This stuff that we as adults kind of take for granted as being something you should know. You should know what a soap opera is. Although I'm sure, Olga, most of your students will know soap operas. Are telenovela as popular as the stereotype is?
Which one, sorry?
The Spanish telenovela. I don't speak Spanish, so I apologize.
Yeah, I know. I mean, at the moment,
just in general as a genre.
We don't usually. I mean, our students don't usually watch telenovelas at the moment.
Okay.
Something from the past, but they are becoming more used to this kind of Turkish soap operas. Turkish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they are quite followers of this kind of soap operas, but these are the adults, okay?
Yes. Yeah.
And youngsters, they prefer the stream series,
Yeah.
okay, on Netflix and so on. But I would like to mention something that we're talking before. Because the kind of topics we usually deal in our classes, sometimes the students who feel more uncomfortable with them are the late adults, okay? Because I mean, in Spain, the educational system is asking us to have a kind of coexistent plans or equality plans. We usually have to name a figure in our school to represent these equality values, okay? So we usually have this kind of special classes in which some of these controversial topics, I mean, when I say controversial, I mean that we should talk about diversity, not only culturally speaking, but also tolerance or fighting against violence against women or LGBT ideals.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, but this is becoming quite normal in our classes. Okay, so we tend to visualize that the differences that we have in our society they are quite normal. I mean, they
Yeah.
shouldn't be avoided. I mean, this is not something we cannot ask in an exam, in examination, an official examination, but it's something that our students, as people, as a community, they should be aware of. Okay, and we usually celebrate this kind of special days. For example, the 25th of November, or we have the 8th of March, or in June, we have special panels full of with information that our students usually contribute with. Okay, so they can express themselves. Okay, so they can write messages supporting any kind, well, not supporting, or I don't know, writing any message is that how they feel about these situations that we live in as a society nowadays. Okay,
Yes.
so they need to feel free to express themselves, but in the language they are studying, of course.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so this is a lovely atmosphere that we usually create in our schools. Okay, because we have more freedom than compulsory studies.
Yes.
Okay, so they need to enjoy these kind of things. Okay,
Absolutely.
learning how to express their feelings in a completely different language and learning about differences and so on.
Do you know there's something about that that just kind of rang a bell with me, and it might be I might be sort of only speaking to my own experience on this, but one of the things that I found when I was learning foreign languages, or even when I was living in foreign places, is a certain sort of psychological freedom in being able to talk about how I felt, or to engage with topics that might have been difficult or challenging in English, but
Mhm.
somehow being able to talk about them, and in my case in French, almost put me at a bit of a distance from the social connections that some of those words had, that I might have had difficulty saying or talking about or expressing in English. There might have been some sort of almost like cultural baggage, if we're going down the kind of cultural
Yeah.
capital route. Some of that cultural capital was less capital and just more kind of hang-ups, maybe. Being able to find a way of expressing yourself in a foreign language, for me at least, was actually quite freeing in terms of being able to say things that at times I would have found it quite difficult to say in my own language. So I think what Olga was saying there is super important. And sometimes as well, because your language level, obviously, in your second language, third language, is much lower than it is obviously at the beginning in your mother tongue, sometimes you've just got to be a bit more upfront about it. No beating around the bush. You've just got to get out there and say how you feel, and that can be quite liberating in a funny way.
Yeah,
I
that's
would
it.
agree with you, Katie. I think as well, it's the case of you're hiding behind that mask of like, um, is my use of the language good enough? Do I need a cheeky subjunctive here, or is it indicative? Which one? You just forget about the matter at hand. I would
Yes,
agree.
you can put your place your embarrassment on your grammatical inaccuracy rather than what it is you're actually saying to someone.
Absolutely, hide behind that mask.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Oh, it's funny, isn't it? The head teacher at my school is a linguist. He taught Spanish and French, and he quite often says when we get him in to speak to our year nines that when he is speaking in Spanish or French, he feels like a different person. And
Totally.
and I think it can be easy, kind of, to hide behind that. Oh, this is Chinese speaking Darren now, and he's different to English speaking Darren, so we can say different things. I think it's quite nice to put that costume on.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the barriers that learners do have, and I think about this all the time, is how much better my language skills were when I lived abroad 20 years ago, however long ago it was now, how much better my language skills were then, but how much lower my confidence
Yeah.
was. And we are asking children to learn these languages and to a certain extent perform them at an age where they're self-conscious, or they might be feeling like, lacking in confidence. Not everyone, obviously, I'm generalizing, but this whole kind of, oh God, don't look at me, I'm so embarrassed kind of feeling that you have at that age really can kind of get in the way of you trying to let go. So being able to have a kind of persona or an identity that you can put on in a foreign language, I think is super important. And that confidence of just having a go and not being inhibited by barriers like the things that we've talked about today, I think it can be incredibly freeing. And it's a shame actually that we're learning to do these things at an age where perhaps we are feeling particularly self-conscious.
Yes, absolutely. I find that quite often when I take my students out for one-to-one speaking. And they're A level now. They've known me since they were year 3, but they still find it quite intimidating to speak, because they feel that immediate judgment. And it is a funny one. It is a barrier, and I suppose that's another kind of cultural capital thing.
I mean, in a slightly different way, I think it kind of is. I mean, it was funny what Olga was saying about being driven to speak English by hunger, because she'd been in Liverpool for long enough and she needed something to eat. When I sort of did the same thing in reverse. I moved to France when I was about 24, 25, and I'm not sure that I'd ever even been to France before. I did it. I'd learned French at school, and I did an A level, and I did a kind of course. I don't think I'd been to France before. I was like, right, I'm going to see the world. Off to France I go. And I'd been there for about 3 days, and I wanted to go and eat in a restaurant, but I don't think, ever gone into a restaurant, and certainly never gone into one by myself. And I walked past the front of this same place about 10 times until kind of desperation and the urge to eat got so overwhelming that I actually had to go in and speak to someone. But that kind of paralyzing fear of having to talk to somebody can get in the way. But I think, I'm not suggesting we starve our students until they've got something to say, but it is quite a motivating factor to go in via the tummy.
I mean, it's an interesting thing, though, isn't it?
Yes, embarrassment is quite a hard barrier to overcome. Okay, so you need to learn, or you need to teach your students how to overcome this kind of embarrassment. And I don't know, there's no problem of making fun of yourself. Okay, and that's what I usually do in my classes. So I tell anecdotes, personal anecdotes, how I experienced my first time in the UK. I don't know, which are the problems you might face for the first time. But I don't know, making fun of oneself is the best way to overcome embarrassment.
Yes.
I think there's a clear...
Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, you go, Fiona.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's really lovely, like, hearing all these stories, because I do think that we are the best tool for our learners. And, we obviously all come from quite different backgrounds, and yet we're all talking about the joy that languages have brought us and the experiences of living abroad. And I think the more anecdotes you share, whether it's, I had a job in a bar in the Alps, and I got to kind of, you can do it in the winter season, go skiing. I did it in summer. But, when you're talking to your learners, maybe not all of them are going to be able to do that, but you can sow that seed, of thought that you could do such a thing. Because for some of these kids, it's not even, the barrier is not even, there's financial, there's their situation, but it's just that, it's just putting that little seed in their head that you could do this, that it could be for you, because I think for a lot of these kids, we've given them this message that languages is not for you. It's for girls, or it's for kids from middle class homes who've been camping in Brittany, or it's for white people. It's for, and I think really the spirit of this whole debate, and what I like about it is, that we really, really have a duty to make sure that we tell all these stories, that we talk about it a lot. We talk about making mistakes and what languages can give you and where it can take you and what you can do with it. And, it only takes one child in that class to be inspired by it, to seek out more, and who knows where that could take them. But if no one's ever put that seed of thought there, and I hope this doesn't come across as very patronizing, but if they've never been shown that in any way, they wouldn't even know it existed. They wouldn't know it was for them. But you are that person who's there going, no, you can actually look up stuff about South America. You could find out this. And then for all you know, that child then becomes an expert and loves that topic and is really interested. And then who knows, they might talk about it in an interview and it might make all the difference. Or it doesn't have to be that every child's going to go and do a degree in a language. And I mean, you hope that some of them will, but it's just tiny baby steps that, you know, the world is for you, it's for everyone. And, you know, it's obviously the dream and it's not always easy to get to that situation. But that's, I think, what's coming across in all these conversations is just trying everything we can to make sure that language and culture is genuinely accessible to all, even if it's just like the nugget of an idea.
Completely agree with you there, Fiona. I think, thinking back to my experience and what I hope is that I think culture and oracy are really interlinked. And for instance, I remember sitting on a plane going to Mexico for the first time when I moved out there and sitting down in the galley with the crew and them telling me where to go, where not to go. And I just like to think that I hope my kids would have the confidence, the articulacy, the ambition just to get up and ask somebody, actually, I'm moving to this place all on my own. Can you help me out here? Can you give me some tips? Can you give me some recommendations? And so I think that kind of, obviously we talk about using the target language, but I think it transcends more a rate putting themselves out there, putting themselves in those situations and just having that confidence to
Confidence, yeah.
just to ask more than anything else. I think that's so important.
Yeah, it's definitely that. I mean, I wrote like 30, 35, maybe 50 letters to language schools in Ecuador before I finally found one place willing to take a punt on me and, you know, say, oh, we could get you a visa. And I got myself down on an overnight bus to London to go to the Ecuadorian embassy and pick it up. And, you know, I'm not saying I was able to get that bus ticket, but all I'm saying is that I really agree with you, Adam. It's not just about language. It's about
No.
languages give you this self-belief, this, God, if you can go to a country where you don't know anyone and find yourself somewhere to live and feed yourself, you know, you're pretty nails. You've got it going on. And I think, you know, those are skills, life skills that are just transcend a language classroom about, you know, having a go. And totally agree with what Katie was saying about how, I mean, I'm a different person talking languages because you just have to cut to the nub, really, because you haven't got all the language. You just get straight in there. And I've had kids write amazing stuff in really basic Spanish where I've totally understood how they feel about their dad dying, or, you know, that was a really profound example where this child had very, very, very little Spanish, but they completely managed to say to me what they wanted to say. And, you know, all sorts of examples tell me what they really think about their teachers because it's in Spanish, so it doesn't count.
But I think what transcends us all of us is that we've had incredible languages teachers that have inspired us, that have shared those little bits of nuggets. I remember the wonderful Elena Diaz telling me about how corrupt Castellon was at the time, and leaving me with the Lonely Planet Guide to Spain and almost being like, "This is your baton, take it, run with it." And that's something that I'll treasure forever. And I just hope that, and I think that each one of us in this conversation today, I think we'll have done that at some point. And if we're talking about cultural capital, cultural social mobility, getting the kids out there, I think that's what we've got to really, really aim for.
100%.
So are we saying, I mean, my big takeaway, fascinating to listen to those last couple of minutes. Are we saying that in order to bridge this chasm, we actually as the teachers are the ropes of this bridge? Are we saying that we actually are maybe just as important as getting them to try the food and listen to the music, because we're the ones who are bringing this culture to life, even if it's a culture that we are borrowing from or are interested in and not our own?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's absolutely what it is because, you know, I mean, it's a bit like with my own teenage kids, you know, they kind of go, yeah, mum, whatever. And, you know, I think teens in a classroom can be a bit like that sometimes. Like, oh, here she goes banging on about living in Ecuador again. But, you know, I know from meeting students years later and the fondness that I have still for them and, you know, they're pleased to see me. And, you know, not all students like me, I'm sure, but, you know, generally I just was a bouncy, positive presence and I wanted them to come to me with their problems with Spanish and I totally got how hard it was for them and how frustrating it was. but you really are like, they may not listen to you at the time, but it's all going in, it's
Yes.
you really are, you're the model, as a parent you're a model for your children, and as a teacher you are a model for your students in your class, and they might not buy into all of it, and you do hear that, but they all speak English anyway, miss, but you just have to not listen to them and go la la la, I'm still going to keep banging on about how amazing languages are, because that's what we're there for.
I don't know where, I know I probably said this last time as well. I probably say this all the time because I'm sure every subject in a school, you ask the teachers of that subject, which subject is special or distinct or the most profound. And if you ask a chemistry teacher, it'll be chemistry, whatever it might be. But I always still circle back to MFL is special, MFL is different, because we are a resource for the students, but then they're also a resource for us. So it strikes me as being one of the most kind of collaborative, sort of shared learning experiences of all the things that you can do, because I don't know how much of my own personal maths background comes into the GCSE maths curriculum. Do you know what I mean? But as a student, they're a resource in an MFL classroom, and as a teacher, you're a resource in an MFL classroom. And I think that collaboration is so special, and I would say unique. Although if we were doing the chemistry podcast, I'm sure they would say the same.
But I think on that, it's quite interesting how MFL can transcend subjects. So I remember teaching the A-level Chinese film a few years ago, and I realized that I needed to talk to my students about male gaze, but I didn't know how to say male gaze in Chinese. So I spoke to some native speaker colleagues of mine who were not Chinese teachers. They teach maths and science, strangely enough, and they didn't know either. But we were able to start having this conversation about their culture, despite the fact that they don't teach it. I was able to kind of have these conversations with people that I might not have spoken to otherwise, because I had an interest in their culture, I had an interest in their language. And I think MFL is one of the few subjects where you can do that, because unless you are a sad language geek like we are, you don't learn a language for the sake of learning a language. You learn a language to do something, to get a job, to move to a country.
And we haven't got time to talk about it all now, but cross-curricular is a big thing that schools could do. Like it does require time and investment. Well, possibly not always. It's mainly time. I mean, I've worked in some amazing schools where they've had all of year 7 in the summer term trundling around all the different departments, and they learnt about an alien in science and analysed his blood, and then went to German, and he was a German speaking alien, and they learnt German, and then they went and made some outfits for him indeed, and it was absolutely fabulous. It was proper cross-curricular teaching where you could have PE lessons being done in a foreign language. You really could do some really out of the box stuff that would make kids realize that you don't just polish off your Spanish in your Spanish classroom, that actually geography is rich with possibilities for a linguist. Amazing. The Andes, and oh my goodness, there's all the different geography in Spain. So yeah, I mean, it's a whole other topic for another day, but I think cross-curricular work is one way to also get that bridge a bit, because a child who maybe doesn't like languages and decided it's not for them might love PE or love science, and if you could kind of say, well, actually, there's a lot of links between these subjects.
Absolutely. I can't believe that it is already 9:30, that we have done our 2 hours. So what I will do before I thank my guests and just round us off, I will say to all the MFL teachers listening, we are the bridge. We are one of the most important parts of the bridge. We're not the whole bridge, but we are a very important part of it. And in order to be a part of that bridge, we have to make sure that our own cultural knowledge and understanding is up to date. So please do tell your partners that this summer, yes, you do need to go and spend 6 weeks in one of your target language countries. It is necessary for your job. It is necessary for the good of your children. We can't be a bridge without it. A huge thank you to my speakers, to Adam, to Fiona, to Katie, and to Olga. The 4 of you have been fascinating. I could keep going all night, although I'm sure you've got better things to do than just sit and chat with me. But thanks to the 4 of you, you've been wonderful.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Really amazing. It's such an important topic, and yeah, it's really great to talk with so many like-minded people.
Just to cut in there as well, say a massive thank you to all the listeners throughout tonight. If you're listening back to this on Twitter Spaces and you've listened to the whole thing and you're listening to this now, huge thanks to you and to all our listeners who might be listening to this also as a podcast. It'll be available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the other ones tomorrow. So you'll be able to listen back to it in due course. Huge thanks from Teachers Talk Radio to all panelists. Obviously, he's one of our own, Darren Lester. That was supposed to be like that football chant, the Harry Kane one.
I appreciated that.
He's one of our own. Oh, Darren Lester. He's one
there
of
we
our
go.
own. Sorry.
I want that clipped and played anytime I walk into a room.
But massive thanks to Darren and Fiona, Olga, Katie, and Adam. Absolutely amazing contributions. At the top of the space, you can see a little link to the for more information about the Pearson School's MFL new GCSE qualifications. If you haven't already checked them out, I'm not an MFL teacher, and I checked them out, and I spent about 25 minutes when I should have been planning my lessons today, going down this weird rabbit hole of MFL qualifications, which was really disruptive to my life. But it also shows that actually there's a lot of interesting stuff there to sort of look at, particularly if you're interested in any way in language learning. So equally, if you're listening to this as a podcast, we'll put the relevant links in the show description. So you can just look down now at your phone and look at the description, and there will be the same link there for you to click on if you're interested in exploring that. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand back to Darren to say bye, which he already pretty much has, but maybe you can just shout bye. And also a massive thanks to Nathan for administrating tonight as well in the background.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.